Hello and welcome to your 5th lecture on photosynthesis. These are the common misconceptions for photosynthesis. There's quite a few for photosynthesis. Most folks think that plants generate biomass from nutrients in the soil. There's a lot of focus placed on soil and how that contributes to plant health. And I think that that leads to this idea that plants are eating from the soil in order to gain biomass. Another misconception is that the reactions of photosynthesis require oxygen. The gas exchange in plants is often mixed up by students. So what's happening to CO2, what's happening to oxygen? So pay close attention to that. The third would be that plants produce oxygen and therefore do not need to use it for any cellular reactions. So because oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis, it all just goes to waste, and they wouldn't actually use it for anything in the cell. That's a misconception. Today what we're going to be talking about is energy acquisition. One of the requirements for living things is to be able to acquire energy, and if you're a heterotroph, you do that in a very different way than if you're an autotroph. Autotrophs, like plants, are self-feeders. You go ahead and you use sunlight and water and CO2 to make your own carbohydrates. Now in this class we're going to be looking at the photoautotrophic food web. And so plants are a really important part of our discussion. They basically take chemical energy, they basically form chemical energy from light. And so that allows for food chains to be able to be sustained on them. So if you're heterotroph, you don't make your own food, you consume plants or animals that have consumed plants. We're going to focus in specifically on photosynthesis, and that'll be energy acquisition for autotrophs, and then we'll look at nutrition for heterotrophs, which we'll do in class. In photosynthesis, where we're focusing on is inside of the leaf. The pigmented regions of plants are the specialized tissues that are involved in photosynthesis. So we can see a full leaf right here, but if we take that and we zoom in, and this is actually a different type, this is actually a lodia, a waterweed, you're going to look at this in lab. But if you zoom in, and you can basically see cells, so cell, 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 cell. There's these individual cells in this leaf, and that's where we're going. We want to go into one of those cells and look at the organelle called the chloroplast. So this is a membrane-bound organelle in eukaryotic organisms, some eukaryotic organisms, only the photoautotrophic ones. And inside of the chloroplast, what we're going to look at are two locations. We want to understand what happens in the stroma and what happens in the thylakoid. So if you look at one chloroplast, so here inside the plant cell you have these 3 chloroplasts. If you blow that up and look inside, what you basically have are these membranous discs. They're like little frisbees all stacked together. And that's where the pigments are. And those are the thylakoids. So we'll be doing some reactions in the thylakoids. We also want to look at the stroma. And the stroma is just the fluid that the thylakoid sits in. So it's got ions in it, water in it, carbohydrates that are being made are in it. And so stroma is the fluid that the thylakoid sits in. There are other parts of a plant cell that are going to be important for us to know, but they serve different functions. One of which, of course, is the nucleus. You can see the endomembrane system in this. You can see the nucleus, the ER, and the Golgi apparatus. So plant cells make proteins. And then they also have these huge vacuoles inside that take up to 90% of the space. We're going to be talking about those a little later in class as well. They also have mitochondria, and they're spaced near chloroplasts because they're going to be, the relationship of photosynthesis to cellular respiration is going to be coupled. Today, though, we're going to focus on the chloroplast specifically. For photosynthesis to take place, you have a number of inputs. The inputs in the system are solar radiation, carbon dioxide, and water. Nutrients I have on the list, I want to include them. There tends to be a lot of misconceptions about them and what they're used for in plants. And so I've got that on the list as well, even though they are not directly related to photosynthesis. So let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Let's talk about nutrients first. You know that nutrients are important. When you plant something, let's say you're planting a bean plant in your yard in the spring, you go ahead and put that bean seed in the ground, and you're concerned probably about soil. How rich is your soil? Does it have too much clay in it, too much sand in it? Is it nutrient rich? And if not, you might add something like compost or some sort of a supplement. Well, what you're doing when you do that, you are providing organic and inorganic nutrients for the plant. The inorganic nutrients of nitrogen and phosphorus are of particular importance to plants. Not because they are made into a carbohydrate in a chloroplast, they're not. But what they're important for are making proteins. As humans, we eat protein to make protein in our cells, but plants aren't eating, at least most aren't. And so how do they make proteins? They're just making carbohydrates here. So they make proteins from nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil. And those come up through transpiration with water. So those nutrients have to be water soluble. If you go ahead and you put your seed in the ground, you better make sure you water so that nitrogen and phosphorus can be surrounded by those spheres of hydration so that they can be taken up through transpiration. So proteins are one reason that plants need nutrients. Another reason plants need nutrients are to make DNA. So if you think about direct growth, if you're going to go through cell division, you have to copy DNA. Where do you get the new nucleotides for DNA? Nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil. So copying DNA, it's also used for ATP, cellular energy. So definitely nutrients are an important part of the story when you're talking about plants, but they are not directly used to make carbohydrates. Okay, so let's talk about 1, 2, and 3 then. Water, you already know how that gets into the leaf. That's transpiration. The properties of water involved in that are cohesion and adhesion. Water is sticky, right? As well as evaporative cooling, which is the driving force that brings water up through the roots and out to the leaves. So transpiration, carbon dioxide, as well as the removal of oxygen. If you think about gas exchange and where that's happening on the underside of leaves. So if you notice, this leaf has been flipped to the underside. You can see the main vein running through the leaf. Now on this underside are basically something called stomata, where there are these little openings, these little doors that open and close that allow for gas exchange to take place. So for our input of carbon dioxide is in a higher concentration in the atmosphere, a lower concentration inside the plant leaf, so it moves through simple diffusion in through the stomata and into the chloroplast, into the cell, into the chloroplast. And that CO2 is directly used to make a carbohydrate. Now, as carbs are being made, oxygen is being built up within the cells. And so oxygen needs to leave if it's not going to be used in aerobic respiration. And so it also leaves through the stomata via via simple diffusion. So CO2 comes in and oxygen goes out. And so oxygen just moves down its gradient from a high concentration in the plant leaf to a low concentration in the atmosphere. And that's a good thing, right? It allows us to breathe and be able to go through aerobic respiration ourselves. So gases move in and out through the stomata. Water, if we go back to transpiration for a minute, the movement of water out of the leaf, that evaporative cooling process, that also takes place through the stomata. And this is really important for plants because if you're a plant and it's a really hot sunny day, you don't want all of your water coming in through the roots and up and out and then evaporating away. So if it's really hot out, what a plant can do is close the stomata. And when those close, gases can't get in or out and water can't get out. It halts transpiration and it halts photosynthesis. and then the plant can wait for a more hospitable moment to open those up and go through photosynthesis. So plants actually have control over the creation of their carbohydrates. They can shut it down if they need to, and usually that's driven by the availability of water. Light is the last one that I'd like to talk about as soon as we talk about the molecule, where the actual molecules go, and then we'll do light. This is a carbohydrate. This is actually what the chloroplast is making. It's a monosaccharide. It's the monomer of a polysaccharide, which is the polymer. And what you see on here, I just want you to notice, what are the atoms involved in a carbohydrate? You've got carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. And that's all that this is composed of. So if we flip back a slide and we think, okay, where is that coming from directly? The carbon and the oxygen in the carbohydrate is coming from CO2. So carbon, oxygen, where's the hydrogen coming from? Water. So these are directly involved. This is the physical atoms that make up a carbohydrate come from water and CO2. You have to have both. And then the sun provides the energy input. So let's talk about light a little bit. When we say that a plant absorbs light in order to fuel photosynthesis, what we actually mean is that solar radiation is beating down on the pigments in the thylakoid membrane. And it's getting them so excited that they actually lose one of their electrons. That's what absorption means. Absorption is the loss of an electron when those wavelengths are bearing down on the pigment molecules themselves. And depending upon the type of pigment it is, you're going to have absorption in different parts of the spectrum. So let's look at chlorophyll A. It's a main pigment in plants. It has plays a really important role in photosynthesis. What you can see is chlorophyll A absorbs in the red, meaning red light causes pigments to eject electrons. They're losing electrons. But, you know, yellow and green and this early blue is not doing much for the pigments. They don't lose electrons there. And so that's what gets reflected back at us is green, because there's no absorption taking place there. The absorption is taking place in the red, and then you can also see there's absorption way down at the end of the spectrum in the purple. And so what we see with most plants is this reflection of green, and that's because green wavelengths don't do a good job at exciting electrons. I'd like to show you a video illustrating this. Okay, so this video is going to show photons of light coming down from the sun. And then it's going to show you a thylakoid within the chloroplast. That's where the pigments are residing, remember. So this is what absorption looks like. If we zero in and show the pigments, when a photon of light actually hits the pigment, that causes electrons to be emitted. And this is the process of converting solar radiation into chemical energy. This is just the start of it. So the fact that pigments can release these electrons is actually pretty amazing. This conversion from light energy to chemical energy, because now these electrons, these little dots bouncing around that you can see, that is the manifestation of light energy, and they have huge potential energy. And those electrons are going to drive the rest of photosynthesis. So that's what absorption means, loss of electrons, and they have very, very high potential energy. So let's look at how photosynthesis is going to work, and then we're going to do a drawing on this. Photosynthesis works by using those reactants we just talked about and making it into a carbohydrate. Now, we can separate this into two main reactions. The first are the light reactions, and those require light. They take place in the thylakoid membrane where the pigments are. That should make sense. Those are the ones doing the absorption. And the goals of the light reactions in the thylakoid membranes are to make ATP, and to generate a hydrogen. The second reaction that takes place is the Calvin cycle. Some of you may have heard of this as the dark cycle, and you don't need solar radiation for this part of photosynthesis, and so it's not included in the light reactions. It's happening in the stroma, the fluid outside of the membranes. And what the point is to take the products of the thylakoid membrane, both ATP and hydrogen, and to rearrange hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen into a carbohydrate. So you actually make the carbohydrate in the stroma. That's happening in the fluid. Okay, so let's take a moment and draw a little bit of what is happening inside of the chloroplast. I'm going to start by drawing a large circle. And for us, this circle is going to represent a plant leaf. Cell. So this will be a single cell within a leaf. And then what we also want to do is draw another gigantic circle. This is totally not to scale, of course, because we want to look inside the chloroplast and see what's happening. Okay, so plant leaf, and then chloroplast on the inside. Of course, it's got the nucleus, got the vacuole, all that stuff is in there. We're just not drawing it. We're going to focus on our two main locations, one of which is the thylakoid membrane. The other location is the stroma, or the fluid. So to begin our story, we look at solar radiation striking the plant leaf, penetrating into those leaves and reaching the pigments in the thylakoid. We can draw our pigments just with little dots. They're arranged in these little circles all over the thylakoid membrane. We're just going to draw one of them. And what happens when light strikes is that pigments lose electrons. Now, what that electron is going to be used for directly, that electron is going to be used to fuel a gradient of hydrogen ions. So inside of the membrane, you're just going to have all these hydrogen ions just building up, building up, building up. And what happens is there's a protein in the membrane here, and those hydrogen ions are going to move through this protein. Now that protein, we're going to name it. It's called ATP synthase. The hydrogen ions are moving from a high concentration to a low concentration, so they're diffusing through ATP synthase. It is just as if you were opening up a dam and water is rushing through. When those ions rush through ATP synthase has this head on it at the end, and it starts spinning. And if you have an ADP bump into it, it grabs those ADP molecules and forces a phosphate onto it, creating ATP. So one of our goals here in the light-dependent reactions was to take sunlight, light-dependent, and pigments and make ATP. So that electron fuels phosphorylation, which is the combining of that free phosphate onto ADP. That's hard to do, right? That's an uphill reaction. ADP is much more stable as DP than it is as TP, so it's hard to add that phosphate back on. When you do add a phosphate to ADP, it's called phosphorylation. And that's a tough thing to do. So you need solar radiation to fuel this process. Okay, so that's one thing that's happening during the light-dependent reactions. The other thing, of course, is we need a hydrogen. So the other thing happening here is a process called photolysis. And this is all number one. This is all the light-dependent reactions for number one. So let's draw another arrow for light, but this time let's have it strike water. Photolysis, photo meaning light, lysis meaning to cut, to split something. So what's interesting is that molecules are in constant random motion, right? They're constantly moving. And water, as you know, is moving quite a bit. Well, what happens when UV radiation is striking water, water molecules can split apart into their components. This happens just regularly. If you have a glass of water or a bucket of water on a deck on a hot day, sunny hot day, you're going to have water molecules that split apart because of those wavelengths of energy, similar to the absorption of pigments where they're losing electrons. And so this happens in plant cells that are transparent. You have water breaking apart into its components. So H2 is two hydrogens. One hydrogen is a proton and one electron. So there's one hydrogen that's broken apart into its subatomic particles. And here's the second one. And then, of course, you have a single free oxygen. Now, usually what happens to that bucket of water on the deck or wherever your water is that's getting hit by the sun is these would rejoin one another and make water, and you would get a burst of heat. But that doesn't happen here. You've lost an electron up here, and so one of these guys is going to go to replace that pigment's loss. And once you do that, once you get rid of one electron, you can't make water anymore. So everything's going to have to go somewhere. Okay? So we don't make water anymore. One of these guys is going to, that loss of an electron, hydrogen ion can just be used in this pump system, the diffusion through the ATP synthase once the gradient's there. Here, though, is what we needed. We needed ATP and we needed a hydrogen to make a carbohydrate. And so that's where it comes from. The hydrogen in the carbohydrate comes from water when it gets split apart. You have a hydrogen and that gets carried by an enzyme called NADP. NADP is just a protein, and it's like a taxi cab, really. It's really good at holding onto hydrogens and then releasing it. So it picks up hydrogens, then drops it off, and picks them up and drops them off. So we're going to add our little hydrogen there, and it came from H plus and that E, that makes a hydrogen, so that's now there. And we've taken care of everything except for oxygen. So the formation of oxygen in photosynthesis, why oxygen has built up in the atmosphere, is simply because water splits inside of plant leaves. So this oxygen will wait for another water molecule to split, and then O plus O equals O2, that's your gas. And that gas will go ahead and diffuse. And it can go a couple places. It can go to a mitochondria for aerobic respiration, or it can keep on moving and it can diffuse out of the stomata and into the atmosphere. Remember that plants are aerobic organisms. They don't have really high energetic demands, so they're not doing anaerobic respiration. Their energetic needs get covered through aerobic respiration. So they have chloroplasts and mitochondria next to each other. So it's really convenient that they produce the gas that they're going to need to make ATP. Okay, that's the end of the light-dependent reactions. So everything that you see here is light-dependent. What we generated is ATP, and we generated a hydrogen. That's what we needed. Now we're going to move over to the Calvin cycle, and that's happening in number 2 in the stroma. So we're missing one of our reactants, and that's CO2. CO2 is going to come in via simple diffusion through the stomata, and that is going to move through the stomata into the leaf, into the chloroplast, into the fluid of the stroma. And then what happens in the Calvin cycle is everything is assembled. So here we've got our Calvin cycle. It's a series of enzymatic reactions. You're going to take your hydrogen from over here, originally from water. You're going to take CO2 from the atmosphere, and you're going to take ATP from the light-dependent reactions. And you're going to make a carb. So the function of the Calvin cycle is to make a carbohydrate. It gets its reactants from the light-dependent reaction as well as the atmosphere. Now this carbohydrate has a couple options. It can go to the mitochondria to get burned into ATP using aerobic respiration, or it can be stored. And plants store carbohydrates all the time. You have vacuoles in the actual leaf themselves. So if you think about when you eat kale or when you eat lettuce, those are carbohydrates, right? And so there's carbs in the actual leaf that are stored. There's also fats in certain plant tissues as well. So if you think about something like a fruit, like an avocado for reproductive purposes, there can be carbs and fats in something like that. You can also store in the roots. So this carbohydrate could be sent to be stored down in the roots for like a carrot or potato. So there's many different ways in which plants can store. One of the questions that you might ask here is, boy, if the name of the game is ATP, then why even do the Calvin cycle? Why don't plants just use solar radiation to generate an electron to make ATP, because there's your ATP? And the answer is that plants don't do that because a carb is much more versatile. You cannot store ATP, but you can store carbohydrate. So when the plant does have energetic demands, it can pull it out of storage, send it to the mitochondria, and burn it into ATP. So it's energy as needed. And so the storability is the reason why the Calvin cycle comes into play. One of the things to note about photosynthesis is that I just showed you in that one drawing one of these systems. You don't need to know these terms, but these are the pigments, right, in the thylakoid membrane. But inside a chloroplast, just to give you an idea of scale, you have lots of those thylakoid membranes, and in each thylakoid membrane you have groups of pigments all over the thylakoid. So all of these are losing electrons, generating ATP and free hydrogens, and then forming a carbohydrate. Lastly, I'd like to show you the coupling that happens in photosynthesis. So if we have the light reactions here and we have the dark reactions here, the Calvin cycle, you can see that this NADP really acts like a taxi cab. It picks up a hydrogen from water in the light reactions and drops it off at the Calvin cycle, and then is recycled. There's so much recycling that takes place within cells. So NADP comes back and grabs a hydrogen and drops it off, grabs a hydrogen, drops it off. ATP is the same way. It's recycled. So ATP is made in the light reactions and then used in the Calvin cycle. made and used and made and used. And so you can see the coupling that's happening there between those two sets of reactions, the light-dependent reactions in the Calvin cycle. That concludes your lecture on photosynthesis.